QSO Today, episode 470, Tony Fishpool, G4WIF. This episode of QSO Today is listener-sponsored. Only you can keep the QSO Today podcast coming to you every weekend since 2014. Please become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor banner on the show notes page or at the top of the QSOtoday.com webpage. I want to thank Robert Culver, VK5RC, who became a $100 annual sponsor this week, and we have an anonymous donation of $100. My thanks for your support of the QSO Today podcast and now the QSO Today Academy. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth, amateur call sign 4Z1UG, where I demonstrate the diversity and relevance of the amateur radio hobby and its impact on society by interviewing ham radio operators, many of whom played vital roles in shaping our technology through the amateur radio hobby. And while many people might say, ham radio, do people still do that? This podcast demonstrates through in-depth interviews just how amazing, diverse, and dynamic the amateur radio hobby continues to be. My friend and colleague Ben Bresky, who has been editing the QSO Today podcast for years, as well as hundreds of QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo videos, has compiled a fabulous work of 5-minute podcasts called The Jewish Moment, an often historical look at the land of Israel, the people, and its interesting places and events. If this subject interests you, there is a link to Ben's podcast in the right sidebar of the show notes pages at QSOtoday.com. The Academy event on demand ends this weekend. If you're a ticket holder and wish to continue to access the Academy resources, please become a listener sponsor today. The cost is $10 per month or save over 20% of the cost of $100 annually. Your listener sponsorship keeps the light on here, as well as the hosting resources that we use to generate and host the QSO Today content. The week after the QSO Today Academy, the High Holy Days for Jews began with Rosh Hashanah. In Israel, this kicks off almost a month of activity, making it difficult to record new podcasts. It is a beautiful time of the year here, with lots of tourists and vacation days being used. I had 2 interviews scheduled during this period, but both canceled at the very last minute. However, with over 400 interviews in the can since 2014, I chose a very special interview that I had with Tony Fishpool, G4WIF, that I conducted in March of 2017. Tony is still active in the United Kingdom's GQRP Club and contributes to the quarterly Sprat magazine. He's the author of a book on test equipment for the QRPer and numerous articles on equipment building with particular attention to detail and budget. I am pleased to present you this re-edited and mastered QSO with Tony Fishpool, G4WIF. G4WIF, this is Eric, 4Z1UG. Are you there, Tony?
4Z1UG from G4WIF. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Tony. Thanks for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. Can we start at the beginning of your ham radio story? When and how did it start for you?
The actual ham part, I was licensed in 1974 as G8HQX, and that was as a result of going to work for a ham radio company a year earlier, and I'd not really known anything about ham radio before.
And how old were you?
18. I was 18.
And what was the ham radio company?
It was KW Electronics. KW were one of the last great English radio companies. All valve stuff then, of course.
And they made electronic gear for ham radio, but also for the military during, say, World War II?
No. They weren't around in World War II, although one day the story will be told about Rolly Shears, G8KW, about his war years, which is quite fascinating. Rolly started the company after he left the army post-war, and I think they had a life of maybe about 20-odd years before Japanese imports became so cheap relatively that they couldn't produce equipment that people wanted to buy for the money they needed to charge. But there were some fantastic radios that are very collectible now.
So what was your favorite?
The KW2000 series was the the most prolific, I think. They had radios before the Viceroy, the Vespa, etc. But the KW2000 series started with the 2000, the 2000A, the 2000B, and then there was a channelized 2000C, which was used for ship to shore.
So these are HF transceivers.
Oh yeah, these are HF bands, and the 2000E was the last one. They all look pretty much the same, and there's plenty of pictures on the internet.
So when you got your first license, did you actually operate a KW Electronics transceiver?
I did under supervision, because my first license was a Class B license, and in those times we had to pass a technical exam, which was written essay type, and then subsequently, if you wanted HF privileges, you had to do CW. And so my first call, G8HQX, was a Class B license, and I was only able to use VHF. Under supervision, though, at the company, and when the company had contests, or when we joined into contests, then I could operate HF under supervision.
I read somewhere that your interest in electronics actually may have started earlier, but then there was something about you working as a butcher in a meat market for a period of time.
Where the heck did you find that?
I dig.
You do dig. Well, I left school at 16, and I left school without having taken any exams. So in the USA terms, you would say that I hadn't graduated, but there isn't that concept of graduating here, because I wanted to go into tertiary education and do electronics, and I didn't really want to have to wait, so I left school as soon as I could, and I took 2 years radio and TV servicing and radio and TV electronics type examinations. And so that was 2 years post-school, and then I needed to find work. But whilst I was at college, I obviously needed to find money to put petrol in my first car. So I got a job working as a butcher for the co-op.
For the co-op, and the co-op is what, like a...
Yes, it's a range of shops called the Cooperative Society, and they're all over England. And it had a grocery side and it had a meat side. And I went for an interview, and they said, right, we'll put you in the meat side. So I actually learned how to butcher meat for 2 years. It paid.
So you trained in radio and TV electronics. Did you ever do radio and TV electronics? Did you do a stint as a TV repairman?
I didn't, actually. So after the 2 years, and after I got my City and Guilds exams, I then wanted a job. And I applied to all of the TV hire companies. 'Cause in those days, a lot of people hired their televisions. They didn't buy them.
Really?
They were so expensive. So they hired them.
When you say they hired them, it's like they rented those TVs, right?
Yes, that would be the same thing. So there were shops all over the place, several in each town, that would rent you a TV. And they weren't that reliable. So the shop that you hired it from would send somebody out to mend it as part of the contract. Well, that's what I thought I would be doing, but I didn't get a job there. Instead, I was directed to KW Electronics, and they make ham radio, I was told. I didn't even know what that was, but I went along and presented my credentials, and they hired me. So I was there from 73 to 75, I think, working on the production line, building these things, and winding traps, and doing all the jobs that the more experienced guys didn't want to do. But that's where I learned about ham radio, and so it became obvious I needed to get a license. So that's when G8HQX arrived in 74.
Okay, so at a certain point then, it's my understanding you left in 75, and the company's demise was not your fault?
It was not. I take no responsibility for that. It was 75, 76 I joined the phone company. KW had said, you really ought to go back to college and get some more qualifications. So they left it up to me what I should go and do. And I found an evening class that was doing a course called Telephony and Telegraphy. And they said, oh, well, that sounds about right. So it turned out that that was a course that taught you about telephones and automatic switching, and it was actually quite interesting. And the guy who taught me, Mr. Baker, said, have you ever applied to join BT? And I said, no. He said, well, I think you should. So the following week he brought me an application form in, and not long after I was working for, well, the GPO, the General Post Office, which then morphed into British Telecom not long after. I did work on Crossbar. I worked on Strowger. I worked on Electronic. I worked on Telex. I worked on all kinds of things throughout my career. It was a great company to work for. If you thought, I fancy doing something different, then you could look around and apply for a job to do something else, and you'd be involved in that. At the end, I wound up working on networks, and that was probably the last thing I did. I actually worked on supporting websites. So in my last throes in the company before I retired, I was maintaining the company intranet.
Well, now we're at a point where networks and telephony are kind of the same thing.
Well, there was a crossover point, probably about 15 years before I retired, where the two networks that the company had were merging into one big cloud.
Tony, you're best known for your work in QRP and writing articles for Sprat magazine, the journal of the G4WIF Club in the UK, where you are the membership secretary since 2005. So back to you, Tony. Why QRP, and how did it begin for you?
During the early years of my career in the phone company, I had married and I was starting to raise a family. Radio was really taking rather a back seat. And the traditional turn the radio on and work people kind of radio wasn't interesting me. So it all went into sort of hold whilst the family was growing up. And then around about the early 80s, I'd met Graham, G3MFJ, who you've interviewed, through the job. Graham and I did very similar jobs. By that time, we were both working in technical support. So we were all over the country fixing things. And Graham's radio was pretty much like mine. We were interested in building things more than perhaps operating. And we also, because our orbits kept crossing, whenever I would go to Yorkshire, I'd end up staying with Graham, and the company's expense account would buy us a Chinese. And when he had to come south to work on something, it would be the reverse. We actually reckon that the company bought us way over 100 Chineses during that time.
And you're talking meals now.
Yes, sorry, Chinese takeaways. And at one rally, you will call a hamfest, Graham and I bumped into George Dobbs, G3RJV. And we thought, what's this QRP thing? George gave us some sprats, and we chatted to him, and he's a lovely fella. And that's where we met George. That's where the QRBP bug bit. But it was pretty much what we were doing already. We were building stuff rather than buying stuff, because the building and the fixing was more interesting maybe than the operating. So having met George, and then having started going to the QRP conventions, that's when we started getting involved with the running of the club. And then we went on the first 4 days in May trip. Are you familiar with that? This
year is my first Dayton Hamvention, and I'm already signed up for the 4 days in May.
It's really the best fun going. And so we joined George over in the USA, working with GQRP on the booth in the Horror Arena. So that's how we got into GQRP, by meeting George, and gradually you end up getting a job if you're around George.
You're the co-author with Graham Firth, G3MFJ. He was my guest in episode 101 of the QSO Today podcast. You wrote a book together called Simple Test Equipment for the QRPer, I think published first time in 2002?
Sounds about right. Yeah, could be, yes.
And now it's out of print. But you did a lot with George, and you continue to do a lot with George. Can you talk a little bit about that book, that effort together, and what came of that?
Right. So, well, Graham and I collaborate quite a lot because we're essentially with George Dobbs, the people who run the club. He is the treasurer, and he also runs the club store. So all of the income is managed by Graham, and I manage the membership. So we're working together quite a lot. We're a couple of 100 miles apart, but obviously technology that we have now allows us to run the club remote from each other. The book, we printed about 200 in the USA and about 200 here, and they sold, and at the end of it we got fed up printing books. We actually printed them ourselves and bound them ourselves, or rather Graham did. So it was a lot of work, and in the end you think, well, I've had enough doing that. And books have their life. After a while, anybody who wants one's probably got one. So at 400 we decided that's enough. It's done. So the book it went out of print, and we don't want to bring it back because there's so many alternatives now to the simple test equipment that we had in the book. And you've only got to look on eBay or this wonderful website that is great at removing money from your wallet. It's called banggood.com. And Banggood has got some wonderful test equipment that you can buy for not a lot. The kits for function generators and all sorts of things, frequency counters for less than £10. Just fantastic. So some of the kind of things we had in the book, there's modern equivalents now. And there are other ways of doing it.
One of the questions I was going to ask you is if you were going to release a new edition of the book, how would you update the collection of test gear?
Absolutely. Page 1, go and buy a TV dongle. Are you aware of these?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Right. So
I don't think they're really sold in America as TV dongles, but they're very popular in, Region 1?
Yes. What a marvellous thing they are, because apart from being able to reprogram to be a radio, you can get software to turn them into all kinds of other test equipment. And there's a rather nice piece of software by a company called Ear to Oak, and I'll find you the link and send it to you, that turns the thing into a spectrum analyzer. So there's just so much you can do with that TV dongle to add to your test equipment.
Right, and we're talking a spectrum analyzer from 10 kilohertz to 3 gigahertz, maybe.
I know they go quite high and way up into the gigahertz. That's true. They don't work very well below about 26 meg. To use them below that, you need a converter, and I bought one, but you can build one. So you can make an HF bands converter that will give you all of that, and that's what I use when my spectrum analyzer. And yes, it will work as an SDR receiver with that converter, absolutely. But again, it will work as a spectrum analyzer with that converter.
I'm looking at the list of test equipment that was in the book. What other devices would you update in the book?
I think I put a Zener noise generator in that book, and everybody should build one of those because they're so useful. And recently, working with Nick, G-A-I-N-E, we were trying to characterize a filter that we were building for the Sweeperino project, and we were getting quite frustrated because the Zener noise generators with 2N2222s amplifying afterwards, their output falls off quite a lot as you get up towards 30 meg. And so I started to play with monolithic amplifiers to try and get a more flat response. And I was getting there, but then Ian, G4WIF, who you've also interviewed, said try a comb generator. And the comb generator, there's an example of the one I built on my website, is a brilliant device, and it produces harmonics that go on forever. And if you look at the spectrum output, the level is pretty much flat. And that's much more useful than my Zener noise generator that the output fell off. So I would recommend, if we ever bought that book out again, I would put the comb generator in there. It costs less than £2 to build. It's so useful.
Well, the fact is you probably don't need to put the book out, because if you keep updating your website with all of your new projects, but you do a beautiful job of the documentation, and the documentation on the comb generator was really terrific.
Thank you.
I'll put that link in there as well. That comb generator, what do you think you had in terms of a budget? How much do you think that cost you?
£2. Well, it's only a couple of chips and a 400 kilohertz resonator, I think, and that's about it. They're so cheap.
And now this mid-show break. The future of podcasting and the QSO Today podcast is listener sponsorship. It keeps us lean and focused on providing you the best ham radio interviews since 2014. You can keep the QSO Today podcast commercial and sponsor-free by becoming a listener sponsor yourself. For $10 a month, or save 20% at $100 per year, you can become a listener sponsor. I am now recording the QSO Today podcast as video interviews that are available only as a benefit to listener sponsors through our QSO Today community website. As I develop the sponsorship tier, I will add bonus content for listener sponsors. Listener sponsors, not donors, are automatically members of the new QSO Today Academy. I am building the Academy website to include access to our Sequel.io networking lounges all of the time, and Academy resources including over 400 previous Expo presentations with Q&A, and additional helpful ham radio educational resources. The benefit of listener sponsorship as an alternative to commercial sponsorship is that commercial sponsors influence the content and comments in the podcast. Listener sponsorship allows a greater degree of freedom to discuss any ham radio subject without commercial consequence. I have eliminated all commercials in the QSO Today podcast from episode 445, with the exception of the Ham Radio Workbench podcast, as I think that this is a serious asset to a well-rounded ham radio education. I am not using Buy Me a Coffee or Patreon, but my own system for managing the community that could form out of the podcast. I direct you to the sponsorship section of the show notes pages beginning with the episode 444, where I list all of the contributors to the podcast since 2014, including sponsors, donors, and hams who have paid for transcriptions. If sponsorship is not your interest, then you can make any size donation to the podcast by clicking on the donation button on the QSO Today podcast website at qsotoday.com. There is a slider that you can use to adjust the amount of your donation. If you want to make your donation monthly, click on the recurring donation box. It is the recurring donations and the listener sponsorships that keep the lights burning here. Finally, you don't have to contribute anything to listen to the QSO Today podcast. You can use my Amazon affiliate link before shopping at Amazon by clicking on it on the right side of the show notes page. This will signal Amazon to send us a small percentage of what you purchase. This is the most painless way to ensure that the QSO Today project will be here next week. I want to thank everyone who has contributed and will contribute to my effort to create this oral history of amateur radio since 2014. It will eventually all be in the public domain for hams in the future to enjoy. Be sure to become a listener sponsor or make a donation today. And now we return to our QSO Today. I often hear in amateur radio circles that ham radio is an expensive hobby.
It can be.
But you give a talk called QRP for the Tightwad.
Oh, you really have been researching, haven't you? Yeah, I do, and I'm doing that again this Thursday. It's just my slant on. It's not that I am really a tightwad, although Graham is from Yorkshire, and therefore he has a view as Southerners, and he reckons that we've got deep pockets and very short arms. But I'm not really a tightwad. But it's just the approach to radio that I have that I get a lot of fun out of the radio that I practice, and it doesn't cost a lot of money, and it doesn't have to.
Well, what's the key takeaway from your talk?
You can have fun and not spend a lot of money. And I think perhaps my talk is not so much aimed as being evangelist for QRP, it's just to say, well, ham radio can be fun, and there's a lot of ways of doing it. And you've interviewed a lot of people who have fun having expressing their radio in different ways. Some of them like contesting, etc. This is my way. I have a ball with ham radio, and I do it building mainly, occasionally operating, but mainly building. And the things that I build don't cost a lot. Farhand Sweeperino project, it's about £30 at the most to build something that is just quite amazing.
Since we don't have Osher on the line, maybe you're going to have to explain what Osher's Sweeperino project is.
Okay, so it's a device that's in two halves. It's a device that uses a logarithmic amplifier to drive an Arduino to measure a level. And it's also an oscillator that can sweep from 4 and a bit meg, whatever an SI 570 starts at, about 4 and a bit meg, up to way beyond 100 meg. And so you can set this oscillator to sweep between whatever limits you choose. And then you put your device under test between these two halves, like a low-pass filter, sweep it, and on the output, you measure the response. And Farhand wrote some software that you can use on your PC that will display that response, just like that. So that's the Sweeperino in a nutshell.
So essentially, you're connecting both sides of the filter to the Sweeperino, and
yes.
it's outputting onto your PC.
Yes, it is. So you can immediately see how that filter you've just built performs.
It's designed for low-frequency filters, but do you see that this project could be adapted up into the VHF-UHF spectrum?
It will go that high, actually. It doesn't work below 4 meg, but there is a device that Nick and I are building now that you can add to the Sweeperino that allow you to sweep below that. And it was devised and published in a Dutch ham radio magazine, which you can download, called Razzies. There are links to that from the Sweeperino article on my website. So Razzies have an add-on to the Sweeperino that allow you to test filters lower than the limits of the SI 570 oscillator. So you can sweep filters practically where you like.
Well, I'm actually thinking that it would be great to be able to sweep cavity filters up in the UHF band, if you have to tune a duplex or something like that.
I don't know that it's going to work that well. I don't know that the SI 570 will sweep that high. But you could use a comb generator and a dongle-based spectrum analyzer to achieve the same thing.
To get pretty close.
Yeah. The output of that comb generator goes way up into UHF. So providing your spectrum analyzer stroke converted dongle can do that too, and it can. You ought to be able to get some response.
What's the project that's on your bench right now?
The problem I have is there's never only one project on my bench. So there's the add-on for the Sweeperino that I mentioned, and there's also one of these antenna noise nullers that seek to eliminate local noise.
And how does that work? I mean, obviously, all of us are plagued with electronic noise.
It reverses the phase. It has two aerials, your main aerial and your local aerial, and it reverses the phase between the two so that the sense aerial, which is only a little inefficient aerial, picking up only the local stuff, is going to be 180 degrees out of phase, and it will cancel what's coming in on the main aerial, leaving only that DX you're trying to listen to.
Theory, it sounds great. It sounds like a great idea.
Well, it does work. It does work because GAINE Nick is ahead of me on this one, so he's built his is working. So I shall document that when I've got mine working.
As I say, if you live in any kind of community where you're closely packed with your neighbors, you just don't hear anything on 80 meters.
No, I suffer from QRM on top band and 80. They're not bands that I generally use. 40 is not so bad, but 80 and 160. This may help.
In 2003, at the FDIM conference in Dayton, you and Graham Firth, G3MFJ, were inducted into the QRP ARCI Hall of Fame. How did that come about, and what was your reaction to that?
I was blown away. The ARCI is, I suppose, America's equivalent of GQRP, And to be recognised by our colleagues in America was quite amazing for us and quite humbling. So we were blown away, to be honest, and it came about, I guess, because Graham and I messing around with radios, and we'd been over there a few times to give talks, so I suppose our faces were known. It was never going to be a lot of trips. It all started when both our families were together at Graham's house one year, and I don't know if it's different where you are, but that's the man's job, the barbecuing. So Graham and I were out there barbecuing, and of course it's impossible to barbecue without the help of some red wine, so we'd had some of that, and we were bouncing around this idea of going to Dayton for the first time ever, because Practical Wireless, the magazine that we have over here, was organising trips. Subsequently, we tied up with George and we went with him with the GQRP crowd. But here we are barbecuing and thinking, well, can we get away with it going on holiday without our wives and family? So when we took the idea in, along with the burnt sausages, we said it's probably going to be one of those once-in-a-lifetime trips. So Graham and I ended up having about 12, 13 once-in-a-lifetime trips to the USA, and we spoke at Pacificon and Atlanticon and Archicon and the Four States QRP in Joplin, and I suppose just because our name was out there, we were considered for Hall of Fame. There's a lot of people who deserve Hall of Fame who don't get recognition, and I guess it's because people don't know they're there, but they're beavering away in the background.
What do you think that people want to know when you go to Pacificon or you go to speak in North America? What do they want to know from you and Graham? What's the secret sauce that you have that you're sharing with them?
I don't always know, but what I am trying to do is to share the enthusiasm, what makes us have fun. And I think if you can speak about what you have fun doing, then you can at least make it as engaging as you can. And I think that goes for anyone who's taught. If you're not enjoying what you're teaching, then it's going to be a bit boring. So, but we have so much fun with what we do in ham radio that I suppose that's what they get to hear.
For the home brewer, what do you think is the most exciting device that's available in the marketplace today that helps you create and execute new projects?
I think the Arduino's got a lot to do with the fun that people are having now. And if you look at all those blogs out there from people like Pete Giuliano, another one of your interviewers, they are doing so much with these little processors that enable you to do amazing things for not a lot of money. And you look at Pete's designs and Nick Kennedy's designs and Farhan's designs. All of these things use Arduinos. So that's got a lot to do with it. But there's just so much chippery out there that's available for not very much. Now that we've got access to component sources via internet from eBay, etc., we can buy all kinds of integrated circuits now that don't cost very much. Some of those are going to be surface mount, but it shouldn't be something that people are afraid of, providing you get a big enough magnifying glass.
Well, a lot of these surface mount chips now also can come on carriers, right? So that you can still tack wires to the big pads.
Or you can buy little boards that you can tack solder these surface mount chips onto, which then allow you to wire on to regular size components. And Rex Harper sells those in the USA, and the clubs at GQRP sells them over here. So you don't necessarily have to have any difficulty working with surface mount, because these adapter boards are available. And of course, it's not that hard to etch your own. And Chuck Adams showed us that using the toner transfer method.
You wrote an article about how to make printed circuit boards with junk mail.
Yeah. Well, you start.
So the junk mail comes on glossy paper. How does that work with the transfer?
Brilliantly is the answer. I started off watching Chuck's videos, and everybody who fancies trying the toner transfer method should watch those videos. Chuck uses a particular kind of paper that he actually buys. Well, because we like going on these cruises with a certain company that advertises quite heavily on both sides of the Atlantic, they'll never stop sending you catalogues. And it's this gorgeous paper that you can cut up that's all thick and glossy. And you just print on top of it and with a laser printer. And then when you use a heat source, such as a laminator, to press that toner into the surface of the copper board, and then soak the paper away. It doesn't leave behind any of the print because that's in there from a different process. All it leaves behind is the toner that you'd printed on there from your printer.
So this allows you to make a very nice one-off board for your project.
Yes, and it doesn't take very long.
What kind of schematic capture and board layout software do you use?
I use some software called Sprint Layout, and it's not one of those free ones. It's not awfully expensive, but it's not free. Let's just remind myself the name of the company that sell it.
Well, I can look it up and put it into the show notes page as well.
Abercom. It's just something I happen to have got used to using, and it really doesn't matter. And there's lots of free ones out there. The one that springs to mind is Eagle. I think Eagle is one that a lot of people use. And
from CADSoft.
Yes, I think it is. And it really doesn't matter. If they'll lay down a track, if they'll allow you to print a track layout, and if they'll allow you to print a mirror, because obviously it has to be a mirror so that when you then press it onto the board, it comes out the right way round, then it will work. So whatever you've got.
Okay, so if I asked you then what your favorite construction technique is, you like printed circuit boards.
Sometimes.
Not dead bug or Manhattan style.
No, I'm not good at dead bug. Manhattan style is the next best that I'll use, and you can make pads by chipping off lumps of printed circuit board and super gluing them down and making circuits using the Manhattan style. And I've used that. I've also used pad cutters to cut pads on printed circuit board. So you can make pads as you need them.
Essentially, you're using a little like electric drill with a hole saw, a miniature hole saw.
Yeah, and you can get these through eBay. So I've used that, and I also use a manual milling method that I've got the hang of now. I have a bench press, I think you call them.
Drill press.
Drill press, right, okay. And I abuse it badly by putting milling bits into it, but I don't cut very deep, so I think the bearings are forgiving me. And I use a vise that can go in two directions, an XY vise. Clamp the board into that, draw what I want it to achieve, the pads I want to cut, and then you just mill it. And so I can very quickly make a very simple board just by milling the pads. If I want something more complex, or if it needs to be surface mount, then I'll etch it.
Have you thought about, like Pete Giuliano, having a $250,000 CNC machine?
Yeah, good old Pete. It didn't cost him that. It's how much it cost him to educate the son who bought it for him. Yeah. I'd love one, but I don't think I need one, to be honest, and I don't need to spend the money on getting a computer-based one. What I have works very well for me. But yeah, isn't it a cool device though?
It is a cool device, but the method that you're using, even though it's maybe a little bit slower and you're actually more engaged in it, for a one-off project, seems like a fine idea.
It works.
What excites you the most about what's happening in ham radio today?
I don't think there's been a time in my memory when it's been so easy to construct stuff. So if constructing stuff is something you want to do, then it's just all out there. And it's not just the components that are easy to get, and they are, but look at all of the resources out there and the people who are publishing blogs and web pages full of wisdom. I mean, all the people we've mentioned so far. Hans Summers, look on his website. There's so much good stuff on there. And there's just never been a time when we've enjoyed so much information and so much teaching.
Yeah, that certainly is true.
YouTube. There's so much good stuff on YouTube. Forget all the cat videos. Just look at all the stuff there is teaching you how to program or build something. There's just so much out there.
If a ham wants to start from the beginning, say with an Arduino project, what project would you recommend as his first homebrew Arduino project?
Something that you can use as a piece of test equipment, like something that would measure the value of capacitors and inductors. There's no Ender designs out there that allow you to do that. Or something that would allow you to learn Morse, like a Morse tutor. Or even something that will allow you to decode Morse to give you the confidence.
So that you can get out there with your straight key and still make sure you got the message.
Exactly, and that's the only kind of key I can use. I've never learned how to use a paddle. I've tried, so it's a straight key.
So if I was going to ask you then, as a QRP operator, what your favorite mode of operation is and band, what is your favorite mode and band?
40 meter CW.
I want to take a minute to tell you about my favorite podcast, the Ham Radio Workbench Podcast, with George, KJ6VU, and now joined by Rod, VA3ON, Mike, VA3MW, Mark, N6MTS, and Vince, VE6LK. Every 2 weeks, George and company offer up a status report on the many amateur radio projects on their workbenches and explore projects on their guests' workbenches. This group is project active and prolific, covering many technical areas of amateur radio. So the next time you want a deep dive into ham radio electronic project building, or to learn about technology, tools, test equipment, construction techniques, and the rest, listen to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast, available on every podcast player and channel. Use the link in this week's show notes page to get to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast directly. And now back to my QSO. Do you contest at all? Can you contest as a QRPer?
Oh yeah, well they're desperate to work you when they're trying to get points, so they're not going to be too sniffy about your weak signal if they want the points. So yes, it's sometimes a bit competitive, but you can do it. I don't enjoy contests. I far prefer to rag chew a little.
And why 40 meters CW? It seems that the number of Brits that I've interviewed for the podcast also hang on 40. Well, they're all people that you know, but why 40 and not 20?
Right. Well, you would say 20 because there's a chance of DX, perhaps. Mm-hmm. But I am not that bothered about how far away the person is I'm talking to. I just enjoy talking to someone. So 40 has got quite a variety of local versus a little bit further afield, most of Europe, of course. So there's always somebody to talk to on 40. It's never dead. So I guess that's why I like 40.
When I was speaking to Keith Ranger, he also has never, owned anything but a homebrew rig, and he operates 40 meters by throwing the antennas over the pictures in his living room.
Yes.
Right. So he's almost operating NVIS, I think, at that point.
You'll always work someone. I wouldn't want to work with the aerial restrictions that Keith places upon himself, but I've only got a small garden. I haven't got the large area that ENG3ROO's got. I don't even have one tower, but a doublet antenna fits in my garden, and it works pretty well. So I don't know if I'd want to sling it over a picture rail though.
But you're using a tuned antenna on 40 meters.
The doublet is a dipole fed with open wire feeder, and so you don't have the high SWR losses that you would have with a coax fed antenna. As you probably appreciate, that the loss in a piece of coax cable can be quite high at a high SWR, more so than when it's matched. But with open wire feeder, losses are low regardless of how high the SWR is. It's a much more efficient system. But of course you do need a tuner of sorts. And my garden shed, which is where I operate from, is right under the middle of the antenna. So it's quite a short run from the middle of the dipole, the doublet, down to the ATU. So it's efficient because there's not much in the way of losses.
And of course, you're using QRP, so your ATU does not have to have 3,500 volt plates.
There's that, and of course the side effect of that is that you tend not to cause too much interference when you're running QRP. But you'll find also that QRPers with experience tend to have more efficient antennas because they haven't got power to throw away.
Sprat is a magazine that is from the GQRP Club. What kind of membership do you have in the GQRP Club, and how many people are receiving Sprat every quarter?
Right. As a membership secretary, I can tell you that. We've got over 4,000 members worldwide, and so they all receive Sprat quarterly, and it's mainly constructional in Sprat. There's very little waffle, and that which is not constructional is usually of interest. The back end of Sprat, you'll see that Chris Page does a roundup of what members are doing, and it's quite interesting to read from people who are not perhaps using internet media to communicate this. They communicate with Chris, and so they tell Chris what's going on, and Chris does a very good 3-page usually write-up every quarterly of what the members are doing. It's been going for 40 plus years, GQRP and Sprat, and it's member driven. We don't write this stuff. Those of us that are involved in the club leadership, mainly it's member contributed, and if you've got the impression that I contribute quite a lot in the way of articles to Sprat, it's only because you've got a few of the recent ones. I have contributed, but I'm not prolific. There's lots of people out there contributing to make Sprat the interesting read that it is, and it's probably the cheapest magazine on the market. In the UK, it's £6 a year. It's only £13 a year in the US.
Well, I have to tell you, I'm grateful to be getting it. And one of the things I like about 2 issues that I've received is I'm looking at the projects. You know, the projects are all made with common parts. You mentioned 2N2222s earlier.
Yes.
You know, you're not going after exotic parts here in order to build and be successful with any of these projects. I also like, this attention to test equipment, because oftentimes when we think of test equipment, we're think of HP or IFR or stuff that costs thousands of dollars. And yet I learned from Farhan, the interview that I had with him, and from talking to you guys over there in the UK, that you can build test equipment for very little money that's quite effective for what it is you're trying to do.
Test equipment is vital because if you've had that frustration of building something that doesn't work, where do you then go? If you're lucky, you've got a local Elmer who you can pick the brains of, and that's how I met Ian G4WIF 30 odd years ago. But if you're on your own, you need test equipment, and of course, as you say, you can build it. So my advice is build as much test equipment as you think you need to help you get the other things working.
Of course, what's the most important piece of test equipment that you have on your bench?
Oh, we have a show on the radio here. It's been going for a very long time, called Desert Island Discs, and they ask the question, what would your luxury be if you were marooned on a desert island? And I think it would have to be my oscilloscope, which of course I didn't build, but there's so much you can do with an oscilloscope. That's my luxury, buy an oscilloscope.
Right, I think I'd agree with you. I think that's probably the most important piece of test equipment that I have as well, is my, it's 40 years old, but it still works.
Mine was 40 years old till it died a year ago, and it died pretty spectacularly. It was a Tetronics, and I bought one of these digital scopes, and I'm really quite pleased with it. And it's only a couple of £100, 100 meg scope. It's just fantastic. Years ago, something with that capability would have cost a lot more.
Yeah, I've thought about a digital scope, but it seems to me that I've heard people say that they're not as sensitive in terms of looking at a real analog signal. What do you think about that? Because these scopes are all digital now.
Well, that's what you can buy. So if you don't want one of those, you're going to buy a second-hand scope. and sometimes you might be lucky and get a good one. But you'll probably pay quite a lot more than you will for a very, very inexpensive, comparatively, digital scope.
But practically speaking, are you at this point even looking back at an analog scope?
No, I don't even miss it, really. The digital scope I've got's fine. Does everything I need. It does more than I need. I mean, I don't have to count the graticules and think, oh, that's a 200 millivolt signal. There's a display on the scope telling me that and telling me what the frequency of it is and the duty cycle and anything else I want it to tell me. It's just quite amazing.
And this is a 100 meg scope?
Yeah.
You mentioned Banggood.com earlier, your Chinese source of modules.
It's an affliction. Yeah.
I noticed you built a digital power supply.
Oh, yeah.
Where you integrated some of these modules. Can you talk a little bit about that power supply?
Oh, a buck converter.
Buck converter.
Yeah.
Right.
Right. Well, these are little switch mode jobbies, and if you look on eBay or Banggood, there's all manner of these little power supplies that you can use. I'm even using a little 1 pound buck converter now instead of the regular voltage regulators that we used to use, 7805s. Well, I can now buy for £1 an adjustable buck converter that allows me to turn it to whatever I want it to be and just leave it there. The module for the power supply, there's a lot of videos on that module on YouTube, and so I watched them and thought, oh, that looks interesting. I already have a bench power supply. I have a lab bench power supply, but I only have one lab bench power supply, and occasionally it's nice to have a source of adjustable voltages, two adjustable voltages. So I thought I need to build another power supply, and I saw these modules being discussed on YouTube, and they're about £20, I think, and they're everything you need. Just add volts. So you build a very simple linear power supply, transformer, bridge rectifier, smoothing capacitor, and poke that into this module. And then you've got complete control through that module of what comes out. You can voltage limit, you can current limit. There's just every conceivable configuration within this module that allows you to control what's happening. So it wasn't spectacularly clever stuff. It was just build a linear power supply and poke it into this module and attach a couple of terminals to the output. It's all done in that module, and it's switch mode. So there's no big heat sinks in there. Not much. No, it doesn't get hot.
How much current?
That one is about I think it's about 5 amps. It's got a bigger brother. Looks pretty much the same, and the videos on YouTube show this. That can go up to 30 amp. So that's quite useful.
So there is a use for these big heavy iron transformers.
Yes, although I could have fed it with a switch mode power supply. So the module could have been fed by switch mode, but I had something already that was a box with a transformer in it. So I thought, well, I'll poke a linear power supply into it.
What advice would you give to newer returning hams to the hobby?
If there's a local club to you, then join. I'm a member of the North Kent Radio Club, and I'm lucky that there's constructors in there, so there are like-minded people. But if you weren't in constructing, if you're into moonmounts or whatever, if that's what turns you on, if that's what gets you excited about ham radio, then hopefully you can find a local club where there's people with like-minded activities. So to try and find people to bounce ideas off and to get help from. And we're lucky in this part of England where there's quite a few clubs. And I'm even luckier that the nearest one to me is has members who have like-minded interests. They're also very keen on doing external stuff. So we go out in the summer and we do lighthouses on the air. We put a tent up on the bank of the Thames and throw a wire up over a tree near a lighthouse. And then we activate our club station there. We also get involved in JOTA. So if you're a beginner, then if you can find a local radio club where there's people who are enthusiastic about radio.
Now, I would think there are some beginners that might say, well, you know what, there's a Yahoo group or there's, an online radio club.
And there are loads of them. GQRP has a internet forum. You don't have to be a member of the club to join our forum. Anybody's welcome. So we have a forum. There's forums all over the place, and some of them really good. Hans Summers has his own forum that supports a lot of the kits that he sells, and that's a fascinating forum. And then there are podcasts like Solder Smoke. There's just so much stuff out there. I don't see how anybody could be bored by ham radio.
Do you think it's really important to actually have ham radio operators in their physical presence around you in order to move your project forward?
Necessary, no. Nice, yeah. The social side is fabulous. So, yeah, if you were on a desert island and you wanted to be involved in ham radio, then go for all of the forums on the internet, etc. But if you've got a choice of joining with people locally and having fun together, why wouldn't you?
I'm in agreement 100%. I look so forward to meeting you at FDIM this year.
Unfortunately, I won't be there, but you will be in the presence of a lot of really interesting people at the FDIM event.
Well, sadly, I'm going to have to come to England then to meet all of you guys.
You will? We have our own convention over here, GQRP convention. We've just kind of got to the point where we're all too old to run one, but we've managed to go into partnership with a club up in the north that's going to put on the GQRP convention for us, and they're going to do all of the organising and donkey work, and it's October, I think. Be news about that on gqrp.com very soon, and you'd be very welcome to come over for that. And meet us over there.
Are youngsters attracted to QRP and QRP building in the UK?
I think probably not, but I think there's a way of getting them interested, and through the deviousness of these maker clubs that are springing up, there's an interest now in making stuff, not necessarily ham radio, and I think. It's a movement that most parts of the world know now. And there's a maker group in London. I'm hoping there'll be one soon down here. And the idea of those is you join, your membership fee goes towards buying resources like drill presses and oscilloscopes and soldering irons and things, and you build stuff. And I think those are the kind of people that you could then infect with ham radio. They will be receptive to ham radio if they're already building stuff. So the maker movement, I think, is where we perhaps need to look. The Scouts also, we got a lot of interest from a Scout group that the North Kent Club assisted at JOTA last year. And we'd never partnered with them before. And we were starting to talk about things that our club can do with this Scout group, which will include, we're going to have a build-a-thon that we'll give them kits, and then we'll go there and supervise them waving soldering irons around and building that kit. We're thinking maybe a medium wave radio or something like that to start with. So maybe we could get some interest in the Scouts too.
So it's kind of like the crystal set that many of us started in radio with. But it's my understanding in Europe that aren't commercial AM stations going off the air?
Even if that happened, all that would happen would be that pirate radio stations would start up. Not just AM. There's obvious things happening with the FM band. And there are commercial organisations that are looking at the FM bands and saying, "Oh, what could we do with that?" And they're pushing us towards digital radio, which a lot of people say isn't as good. Well, at least the standard that we've adopted in the UK isn't. It's awful. So if we ever move towards clearing the FM band, all it would do would be to open up lots of spaces for all of these pirate FM stations that are sprung up all over London. So it ain't going to die.
So a receiver kit for a build-a-thon for kids then still makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, because it's always going to be stuff that they can hear. If it's medium wave, they'll hear stuff from all over the place. And they'll be able to receive FM, whatever happens to the FM broadcast band. It isn't going away yet in the UK. There's been a lot of resistance.
A lot of resistance to actually taking these things down.
Well, because most of the cars in the UK have got radios in that can only receive FM broadcast. They don't have digital radios in, so if they were to shut the FM broadcast bands down, nobody's car radio would do anything. So there's resistance there, and I think it'll be a number of years before we actually do close FM broadcast down.
Jason, I've kind of grown to think that the purpose of the car radio is to provide an amplifier for my iPhone for listening to podcasts. And
oh, well, you have to be very. Oh, if you listen to this podcast, yeah. If you're operating your phone over here, you're looking at a big fine if you're operating a phone mobile.
Oh, so you can't make a telephone call with a cell phone in cars in the UK?
Not unless you've got a hands-free kit.
That's true here too. Yeah. You could get I think it's a $250 fine if you're holding a cell phone to your ear while driving. Anyway, Tony, I want to thank you so much for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. I've really anticipated this conversation for a number of weeks now, and getting the two Sprat magazines, a week ago and having a chance to look at those before speaking with you is also a real bonus. So with that, I want to wish you thank you and 73.
It's been fun for me too. Thank you very much, Eric. 73.
That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope you enjoyed this QSO with Tony. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in G4WIF in the search box at the top of the page. You may notice that some of the episodes are transcribed into written text. If you'd like to sponsor this or any of the episodes into written text, please contact me. Support the QSO Today podcast by first joining the QSO Today email list by pressing on the subscribe buttons on the show notes page. I will not spam you or share your email address with anyone. Become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor buttons on the show notes pages. Your value for value support is recognized on the QSO Today podcast and in the weekly show notes. Use our Amazon link when you shop on Amazon. Clicking on this link before you enter Amazon will allow Amazon to pay us a small commission on what you purchase. This is a very painless way to support the QSO Today podcast. QSO Today is syndicated on every podcast platform, including Spotify and the iTunes Store. Until next time, this is Eric 4Z1UG 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.